Message, as I told you, was birthed out of desire to present the proof or proofs of the resurrection, which is the foundation of our faith. If that's not settled, everything else that we do is sand. If that one fact is not sure, everything else can be filled in as you go, but that one area has to be settled. I started off this trip by presenting Paul. I said he represents what I call the effect. But then I decided, no, wait a minute, we've got to go back a little bit. I've got to take a couple of steps back. I jumped the gun here because, to talk about Paul as a star witness in a courtroom because he's not part of the original band of disciples is brilliant, but I think it probably merits stepping back a little bit more. So last week I stepped into the trial and kind of presented of Caiaphas specifically on the subject of Jesus and tried to present the charges. And I have not even had the time. Normally I'll take the time to listen back, hear back what I've said, but I didn't even have the time this week to do that. So based on everything that was said last week, let me just say this. I realized without hearing back what I presented to you that I may need to elaborate on some terms. And if you know these terms, that's great. And if you don't know them, that's great too. So the Pentateuch I refer to as the first 5 books of the Bible. And the ordinances that are contained in the Pentateuch, we're going to give a picture image for you, and we're going to call them in type. We're going to look at the Pentateuch as nouns, as substantives or nouns. And I say this for a reason, because I also mentioned the Talmud. And picture the Talmud as the adjectives of Jewish Hebrew living. So if the Pentateuch is the hard, cold outline, I'm using nouns because the Talmud is the adjectives to that. Gives you the description of everyday life and living that the Pentateuch may not give. The Pentateuch will tell you, the first 5 books, of what this says. The Talmud colors it in. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yes. Good. Okay, so the Talmud is like an encyclopedia of life and living. It gives civil, penal, ecclesiastical, as well as divine applications in Hebrew life. Then there's another term that I used, and I used it a lot, which is the Mishnah. This is a mass collection of Hebrew tradition law reduced down to writing at the close of the 2nd century. So when I use these terms, I do use them, and I'll throw them around thinking, well, everybody knows what this is. And I thought, well, I better go back a little bit and explain. Then there's a term I have not yet introduced, but perhaps will in the future, which is the Gemara, which is a rabbinical exposition of the Mishnah. So the Talmud is the Mishnah and the Gemara combined. If you want to put that all together, these are the terms I needed to go back and make sure everybody knew what they were. I kept saying, well, Maimonides did this, and he said that, and the Mishnah says that, and somebody, mishmash. Oi. Okay, so now that that's settled, I reduced the capital crimes punishment, the punishments for capital crimes, into an acronym, BS. I know you'll all remember that. When you think of this, you'll think of BS. Beheading, strangling, burning, stoning. Those are the punishments. And I'm breaking this down carefully. Don't think this is just a road, let's go down and let's itemize, because we're going to see something very specific. When you start to take the law and you understand how this law worked, you're going to see that we don't have the details in the trial with Caiaphas, but we can know certain things from these books that I've just referred to that help us fill in the blanks. So, if a person wanted to know, well, for example, why would a person be beheaded? You would be beheaded only for these: murder, communal apostasy from Judaism to idolatry. That's it. You could not really be beheaded for any other reason. If you committed adultery, kidnapped, false prophecy, striking a parent, prophesying in the name of another god, or rebellion of another, those 6 acts, the punishment in terms of a life punishment strangling. 10 acts for the following. They're all acts of incest. 10 forms of incest within the Jewish law. And it's very clear, by the way. They all have to do with females in the family, except for one, and that one is incest with one's own son. The rest of them are with one's own daughter, with one's own daughter's daughter, stepdaughter, stepson's daughter, so forth. So, any of those 10 acts, and you can go back and see that there had to be, before the law, there had to be some form of understanding that this was a punishment for incest. Why? Because if you remember when Tamar is caught in that passage in Genesis, she tricked her dad, he gets her pregnant, and then he says she should be burned, or they say she should be burned. There was a law before the law, I'm sure. There was some unspoken, unwritten law that this was the form of punishment that then got put into the law that was then implemented. If you committed any one of these 18 acts, which I'll just name a few, I'm not going to read them all, but magic, blasphemy, necromancy, cursing a parent, violating the Sabbath, bestiality practiced by a man or a woman. It goes on. And the last one is really interesting in this list of 18, violation of filial duty. And as I read that in the law, lights went off. Just, wow. That means like the prodigal son. He violated his duty. When you go back and read the prodigal son, he was supposed to do something, being heir to. And in violation, he could have been stoned by law. You think about that's quite radical. But these 18 acts, if you were caught and the punishment was communicated, you'd be stoned. In Jewish law, there was no such thing as imprisonment. People did not get put in prison as we do customarily today. Somebody commits a crime and they're warehoused. No, the only time people were put in prison was to be detained. That's it. Now, why am I telling you all this? Because these will give you some color as to the nature of the law, to understand. We tend to say, well, the law, and we think do, and don't do. But there are nuances and shades. For example, I've taught a lesson here, and Dr. Scott taught a lesson on the cities of refuge. If you accidentally killed a person, you could flee to the city of refuge. God made a provision for that. If you stole, if you were guilty of theft, you would become a slave. There are all these provisions in the law. It's very fascinating. And then if your punishment was to receive stripes, you could receive no more than 40 stripes in a Jewish court. Romans had another idea, but we're just strictly speaking of the Jewish realm. And I'm trying to give you the coloring of the background of what we're dealing with so that you can kind of say, you're right, I hadn't considered that. These are all dimensions of things that, considering what Jesus is being charged with and the nature of how they are charging him with false witnesses, and then these false witnesses fall through, and now there's this new charge. We need to understand, how could they, if he was proven guilty of something, how could they have punished him? So we know absolutely the law prescribed in Jesus' case, if he was guilty of blasphemy, to be stoned. End of story. Now, in terms of what the Jews considered to be the worst form of punishment, beheading. They thought that was the most awful, gruesome form of punishment. The only thing that I want to highlight here is that Jews did not, contrary to whatever people have said, Jews did not exercise crucifixion like the Romans did. What they would do is they would stone people, kill them, and then hang their bodies up somewhere to be displayed, public ridicule, and that body would have to come down before sundown, and that's the only time that bodies were hung. Now, somebody may say, well, what about Rizpah? Well, that's a different story, but I'm just telling you, that's generally speaking, anytime you committed a capital crime, these are the punishments. Now that I've said that, you realize that the Jews, the Hebrew leaders, the Jewish leaders were very limited in what they could mete out as punishment. Now, we're not talking about BSBS, the acronym I just gave for, but specifically attached to the crimes they are allegedly going to say he is guilty of. That brings me to the next process of things, which is the Hebrew tribunal. And we don't have this information in the Bible. You've got to go to these other sources. The Talmud will help in some areas. The Mishnah will color in other areas. And that's why I've referred to these, because these are where I have gotten my information from. So technically speaking, if somebody said, well, is this typical? The way this courtroom event happened with Caiaphas, is this typical? The answer is absolutely not. So to better understand what we're dealing with, again, I'm giving you color right now. You don't have to retain these facts. It's just color. There were 3 kinds of courts within the system. The biggest one would be the Great Sanhedrin. 71 members would sit to hear everything. The second one was the Minor Sanhedrin, where only a portion of those people would sit, and then the lower tribunal made up of a court of 3. All of the powers that they possessed, even if it was in the minor court, executive, judicial, they could communicate anything. Now, there's going to be some controversy, some things I'm going to say later on that have been hotly debated as to whether the Jews had the right to govern themselves and to communicate their own sentences, or whether they had to seek permission. And there are books upon books. I was tempted to just bring them here and set them up and divide them into 2 categories to show you how many people have argued this. I'm not going to argue that. I'm only going to make one statement about it. It'll come up later. So, somebody might ask, why 71 members? Why 71 people? And the legend, if you take it from this way, is that when Moses sent out the 70 elders and Moses made one as 71, and that tradition continued thereafterwards. How is this broken down then? So this becomes important. 23, the number of priests, 23, the number of scribes, 23, the number of elders, and 2 presiding officers make 71. Now, in this list, you're going to find something fascinating. I think it's fascinating. We're looking at the time of Christ. So let's write these numbers out real quickly. You've got 23 priests. Their concern would be sacerdotal, anything that is priestly or religious. 23, the number of scribes. Theirs would be the legal and we'll call it literary responsibility. 23 elders. These were, we'll call them patriarchs within the community and the population. That was their responsibility. Then you've got these 2 presiding officers. So you have 71. Now what's interesting, I've got to do this in a different color. We never stop to ask these questions, and if you have, good for you. And maybe you're like, wow, I don't even want to know about this, but you're going to know anyway because you're trapped here, right? Okay, so we talk about people we know in the Bible. Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus, and other people. So here's what's interesting. In the elders department, Joseph of Arimathea, that's my abbreviation, he's in the group of elders. Nicodemus. And you've got a whole group of other people. I won't write them all out, but there are 10 that we can certify, we know are elders. And then in the number of scribes that we can certify, I found 13. There was a 14th one, which I found was dubious. But amongst these, a famous name, Gamaliel. Probably spelled that wrong. Gamaliel. There are names like Onkelos, Rabbi Zadok, Abba Saul. So there's a whole group of people we can identify. We could probably identify the priests if we went down. Do you remember the Christmas message where we went and we started itemizing the priests? We could probably identify who the priests were, not just the priests serving, but priesthood of families that were there at the time in that area. So don't think of the Bible as, by the way, just simply, we have this little bit of information. In fact, I'd go so far to say, seeing that Gamaliel's part of this bunch, it would not be absurd to say possibly in this 71, Saul, future Paul, might have been in the midst. That's a question mark. That's not even a fact. That's just a question mark. I guess the other thing that is really important is to recognize that because these two men, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, are part of the elders, you now have some idea that if there was a council present, they would have to have some representatives of each area. Even the lowest and minor court of three would require representatives essentially from each group. Now, I'm not saying that Joseph of Arimathea or Nicodemus was present at this meeting and hearing of Caiaphas, but I'm simply saying that we have a lot of information we tend to just jump right over. And I'm trying to go slow to say there are also other things that have been hypothesized. I do not want to confirm them. I will tell them to you. I don't want to say that they're fact because I personally cannot confirm them as fact. But it has been proposed, allegedly, although the dates are completely wrong, it has been proposed that Nicodemus is the Nicodemus who appears in the Talmud as Nikodman Ben Gurion and is recorded in the Talmud as such. And it'd be very strange to say, was Nicodemus a common name? Well, maybe it was, we don't know, but here's a man with the same name appearing at that very same time. Equally dubious in my opinion, but it has been hypothesized that Nicodemus is the brother to Josephus, Flavius, the chronicle writer. The only issue I have with that is that Josephus apparently was born in 37 AD, and we know from Nicodemus being alive at this time, he had to be at least 30 years of age to qualify as serving on the greater portion, the body of Sanhedrin, so the fact that they could be brothers is just dubious to me, but I'm putting it out there. What does this do? Well, it makes you look outside the pale a little bit. It makes you consider that maybe we don't have everything in here, but we can go to these other sources. And when you begin to look at the other sources, you kind of go, yeah, I probably hadn't considered this. So I've just given you a picture. Undoubtedly, the two presiding officers, one of the two making the 71, could indeed be Caiaphas, or Caiaphas could be counted within the priests. We don't know that. That also is a fact that's highly argued. Now, what does this have to do with the price of tea in China? Lots. Sorry. Let's take a look at it. I've just given you a picture of the bodies that would be potentially serving, if there was a real trial. If you go to some apocryphal sources, they will tell you that there were 40 members in the apocryphal sources. There were 40 members that at the trial of Jesus, 40 of them present to dissuade Caiaphas because they were for Jesus. The rumors of his miracles and the things that they had seen, that was too overwhelming. And I believe if there were a possibility to slip in the two, Joseph of Arimathea would be one. Nicodemus, of course, I think would be another. He came to Jesus by night. We have the record in John 3. Now, concerning Caiaphas, this is where it gets good. You won't find this in the Bible. You'll find this in other sources, including some of the references that I'm going to reference come out of Josephus's writing. Caiaphas enjoyed a very unique experience among high priests as a Jewish leader at the time he was serving. His father before him, Annas, was the high priest and served his set time. And then Caiaphas is now serving. And when, I believe it was Gaius, was removed from overseeing as governor and Pilate was installed, normally when they installed a new Roman governor, even the Jewish leader who was the head would be removed and replaced. That was not the case with Caiaphas. And these are these small connections. If we were in a courtroom right now, I'd say these are the small connections that legally I want you to keep in the back of your mind that would become evidence later on for something. Seems to me that enjoying that special privilege of staying on is very suggestive. Now, you say, well, you're grabbing at straws. Not yet. Caiaphas will be removed from office in 36 or 37, depending on which calendar you use, which is the same year that Pilate is removed. He is called back to Rome to respond to Tiberius about charges of a mass slaughter that has occurred. 36 AD will be an important year for Joseph of Arimathea as well. We'll get there. Oh boy, how many dangles did I just do? So I don't want you to just think these are random things like he served his time and then no. Something happened in 36 AD that was a great stirring that was going on. Now, the temple had not yet been destroyed. So there's something going on that will send people like aftershocks of an earthquake that will send them out of the epicenter that once was. So these are the things, as you begin to gather information, that you realize are important. Now, let me give you a time span. Caiaphas is serving from the best date as high priest for 18 years. That's a long time to serve as high priest, from approximately the year 18 to the year 36 or 37. And I said that times are crucial. His dad, Annas, served from 6 to 15 AD. And why do I say this is all important? Because if you think of it, these two men, as the most important spiritual leaders, probably witnessed the child Jesus at the age of 12 preaching and teaching in the temple. And if you begin to think about this, they probably were around, and undoubtedly when he went in those 3 years of his public ministry, they heard the reverberations of Jesus going in and turning over the money tables and calling the Pharisees and scribes hypocrites. So if you think about it, this is a family affair now. We're not just talking about, hey, old Dad Annas has got some issues here. We got a family now that will be absolutely adamant against this Jewish rabbi, preacher, whoever he is, that is stirring up the people. So this is why these dates are important. If you want to know what happened to Caiaphas, because he just disappears. As quickly as he's introduced here, he just disappears. In 36 AD, he is called away. He is removed from his post and he's called away. And he just vanishes. Now, there are legends around he and his family that they were overtaken by infectious diseases and died terrible, painful deaths. If you want to see how Caiaphas traveled into the Western mind, all you have to do is read Dante's Inferno. And you get the idea right there. Caiaphas is encountered in the sixth circle in the lower hell. And that's the mindset, by the way. If you look at art, that's another telltale sign of how we receive our information. If you look at Caiaphas in art, remember the criteria for a high priest, that he had to be without blemish. He had to be of goodly appearance. And yet you'll see a lot of the art, usually Christian artists, depicting Caiaphas as got a bunch of boogers on his face, and he looks kind of rough and ugly and not good in appearance at all. So we have to be careful about how we receive our information. Yes, and I'm sure the boogers will help you. There's one more modern writer, Oscar Wilde, who in his writing, in his definition and picture, he actually depicted Caiaphas as like a type of Judas betraying with a kiss. So you've got a little background there. I want to put some color on these people, otherwise they stay in the book. We don't really know too much about them. And then you can't really put flesh and blood on all this, because I'm about to tell you some of the things that are so crazy about what happened that we don't consider these. And I've told you about the whole council itself, the 71 members. I've told you about Caiaphas. Now let's talk about when something came up that would be tried. So how did they vote, and how did the system work? And this will also be imperative for us to know, based on what we need to know, to see how illegal what they did, how they carried this out. I mentioned this last week, and I said, no, I got to go back and elaborate, because it's just too quick to say, oh, it's illegal. Give me specifics, and I will give you specifics. So this system, this Jewish legal system, had no lawyers or advocates. You could basically, on the witness system, an eyewitness And unlike our system where we'd have one sitting judge, 3 people were required to render a decision. Do you already see one glaring issue? We tend to read the trial of Jesus and we think that Caiaphas made a decision. Did he? Did he make a decision? Come on, yes or no? Good. At least a few of you are on the queue with me. He didn't make a decision. He made other people make the decision. The other people around him, he said, do we need any more witnesses? What do you all think? He didn't say guilty, guilty, guilty. He said, what do you all think? That's a great politician right there. So what we have, for example, in our legal system, we have one judge, a jury, a trial. But under Mosaic and Talmudic law, at least 2 witnesses were required to convict an accused person. The witnesses had to agree, otherwise their testimony would be rejected. Hebrew law did not permit the use of circumstantial evidence. Hebrew law did not permit the use of hearsay. Okay, here come the false witnesses. We finally found 2 people that'll come up and say something. We heard this fellow say, or it was told to us. Now, if there was somebody listening in who was going to apply the law, hearsay, reject that, strike that off the record, or that circumstantial evidence cannot be applied. So we already know what the law prescribed. The reason why I'm going through this is as I began to examine, I thought, wow, this is not just a kangaroo court. This was just like, come get her done. Forget about doing anything. Well, we got to get this job over with, right? So by law, there were 2 sets of questions required to be asked. You cannot get away from it. Don't think this is just some new thing now I'm telling you. This is as ancient and predates Caiaphas. 2 sets of questions. The first set of questions called the Hakiroth. The Hakiroth had to be answered. It's a set of 7 questions that go like this. Did this event happen in the year of Jubilee? Was it an ordinary year? In what month? What day of the month? What hour? What place? And can you identify the person who is accused of the said crime? Now, this will tie into perhaps why, just penny thoughts going out here of why Judas might be required. See, if somebody had to identify this man and no one could step forward, although Judas had vested interest, he couldn't be considered a witness, but he could certainly identify Jesus. So we're going to do this 2/10 of a mile deal, or 3/10 or 3/4 of a mile by getting around the law somehow, and this could have possibly been the way to do it. Failure to answer any one of these 7 questions, your trial is over and you are acquitted. We have no record of this being put forward. There's no record of this happening. The second set of questions is the bedikoth, which is basically equal to a cross-examination. Anything else can be introduced or asked at that time. But failure to do the first throws out the second, and the whole thing has gone out the window. So let's see if we can put a couple of these summaries of what went wrong here. What is totally illegal about this? Remember, these are people who wrote the law. They lived by the law. They love the law, right? Ah, good. It was illegal to try a capital offense at night. That's what they were doing. It was illegal to cross-examine the false witness. In other words, once the false witnesses were proven false, there was no further way to cross-examine, to pursue it. It was done. It was over. And by that, the accused should have been acquitted and dismissed, and it's over. The testimony of the witnesses were not only false, fabricated, but they were hearsay. The oath that Caiaphas said, I adjure thee, that oath, if you read Jewish law, was illegal. No man, or if a woman is being tried, are required to swear an oath of any kind at any time. In fact, the law frowns upon it. So when you begin to look at these, there's more here. The illegality of not separating the witnesses, as I said, hearsay, circumstantial evidence, the fact that we have no record of the Hakiroth or the Bedikoth being asked, inserted, or implied. So if you take all of this, what ground do you have for a trial? None. Which is why you find this immediate shift. Caiaphas, just as quickly as the witnesses fall apart, he shifts gears in making Jesus swear this oath, if you will, which occurs in Matthew, and we'll turn there to see what exactly I'm talking about. It's not clear to us because we wouldn't truly read it like this, but in Matthew 26 and in verse 63, the high priest said unto him, I adjure thee by the living God, essentially swear by God, swear by the living God, that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God. Now, all I want you to see here is when the first thing fell apart, he switched gears to the second. Listen to Jesus' response. Thou hast said, nevertheless I say unto you, hereafter shall ye see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in clouds of heaven. Then the high priest rent his clothes, saying, He has spoken blasphemy. What further need have we, not I, we of witnesses? Behold now, ye, you all, y'all, have heard this blasphemy. Listen to this. 2666, perfect number, 666. What think ye? They answered and said, He is guilty of death. If you comb the records, Matthew, Mark, you'll have the same Caiaphas never says guilty. He just simply, he rent his clothes. Now, by the way, if we were in a court of law and you were going to examine that already would probably be, even though that was customary for certain things, that would already be illegal. You would be persuading or influencing other people by your acts. So I'm trying to tell you that something radical happened here. Now, if you go back to what I said, and even if we suppose, as the Apocrypha says, that there were 40 people present to try to persuade and in favor of not going after Jesus, there's also something very slanted there, which is if, and that's why I say it's Apocrypha, and I cannot verify this because Jewish law says that a majority is required. And if there were only 71 and 40 within the Apocryphal literature voted to save Jesus, then they've already pushed the line, and again, it should have been dismissed. So there's all of these pictures in here that we wouldn't necessarily take the time to examine. Now, you come back and you just see a few verses and you realize, well, we don't see the rest of the story. As I'm showing you, there's a lot more here. Now, listen to what happens. Caiaphas asked them, What think ye? They answered and said, He is guilty of death. Then they did spit in his face and buffeted him, and others smote him with the palms of their hands, saying, Prophesy unto us, thou Christ. Who is it that smote thee? Who struck you? Well, listen, if he's not blindfolded, it doesn't take somebody who can work miracles to say who struck you, because he's standing right there with eyes wide open. You got to go to Luke to realize that he was blindfolded. These are these what I call these significant internal proofs of the verity of the writers themselves, that they weren't trying to be that precise. Otherwise, Matthew, who was basically using Mark, would have included that detail going off of somebody else who had corroborated the story with Luke. Didn't happen that way. Now, of course, the charge is going to be changed. So after this trial, it says, verse 27, Matthew 27, verse 1, When the morning was come, all the chief priests and elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. And they have bound him and led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor. Delivered him. I'm just writing that down because this word will become a significant word later. It's self-evident to say they were going to hand him over. Now, I introduced this last week. How is it possible, considering the time of day, by the way? It's now early morning. And atypical in that land, people were up usually before the sun came up to avoid the heat of the day. Very, very different culture, very, very different system. But consider the probability of being able to leave from it, essentially an all-nighter trial, and show up and just casually waltz into wherever Pilate is and say, hey, we're here. Now we got this guy. And I don't think it happened like that, which is the relevance of understanding. I mentioned the date of how long Caiaphas had been high priest. And no coincidence, perhaps, that Caiaphas disappears at the same time that Pilate is called away to Rome. Now, I like introducing these things because they open up possibilities of thought to consider. Was there some hand up that Caiaphas had on Pilate to facilitate just coming in and hearing something on the eve of a feast, on the eve of what would be a very boisterous and tumultuous time anyway, to just have this, connection? Says there's something more to this. And there'll also be a Joseph of Arimathea connection as well. As we begin to look at that part of the equation, we'll see that not all of these things are so fragmented as we suppose they are. If we just only had the gospel records, we would see these vignettes as they are with nothing to attach them to. So bear with me. Now, in order to get the Romans to intervene, it would require Roman interest at stake. So bringing the charge of Jesus saying that he said he was God or he thinks he's the Christ, really, that's not going to fly with Pilate. That's not going to work. And this is when you begin to look at these things, and I'm asking you today to do something different. This is not the type of message where you're going to be going, wow, I'm floating to the ceiling and I feel... This is a thinking person's message. When somebody asks you why you believe in what you believe, you have studied all of these pieces and you say there's something there. Now, let me introduce this. There's something wrong with the trial before Pilate. There's something wrong with Jewish leaders just entering in. They didn't actually enter into his unclean hall, but they entered into his presence, bringing this prisoner Jesus with them. There is something wrong with Pilate, and I'm being serious. And let me tell you what it is. If you study secular history, all we know about Pilate is that he was in Judea for 10 years. He appears... his appearance is a little bit more laid out and clear than his disappearance. But the character of Pilate is what I want you to focus on. I painted a little picture of Caiaphas. I want to paint a little picture of Pilate to get you to understand what's wrong with this picture we're going to encounter in the Scriptures. Pilate had a reputation of doing terrible, terrible things. In Luke's Gospel, in the 13th chapter, in the first verse, it says that there were present some at the season that told of him, of the Galileans, whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. Sounds like a nice guy you'd like to hang out with, right? The common interpretation of that passage is that Pontius Pilate had massacred a bunch of people while they were sacrificing, while they were offering their sacrifices. That's the common interpretation of that passage. It's commonly known that Pilate took money from the Corban, from the Jews. He took that sacred Corban, the money that went into the temple, to build an aqueduct. That outraged the Jews. That made them so mad that he was using that sacred Corban. He confiscated the money. And then, on his way to supervise the building of the aqueduct, he has his men, Pilate has his men, Roman centurions, Roman guard, disguise themselves as Jews and go in and massacre a bunch of people because he felt that there was tension against him. They were trying to get him to stop the building and went in and massacred a bunch of people. And the last act in the chapter of Pilate's history that we know about, that's recorded history, and then he disappears. All of this paints a very violent man who is very angry and has issues towards the Jews and is full of the typical, what you would really paint as a typical picture of a Roman personage of that age. It's very barbaric, killing and blood, and no issues with that. And the last chapter that is recorded of Pilate in history happens about the time there was a false prophet that arose up, and basically this false prophet had told a bunch of Samaritan people, he said, meet me at the foot of Mount Gerizim, and I will uncover vessels of the tabernacle that Moses has hid. Follow me up the mount, and I will unearth them. And Pilate happens to be coming by that way, and he sees a bunch of people that are ascending the mount with this false prophet. And Pilate thinks they are a bunch of revolutionists. They're going to lay a charge against the city, or maybe something against Pilate or against Caesar. So they slaughter the bulk of these people, Pilate and his men. And the screams from the Samaritans were so loud that it fell into the ears of the governor, Vitellius, in Syria. And he was the one that got the message and so forth. And then Tiberius tells Pilate, you get your derriere back to Rome. We have to deal with this now. And by the way, Pilate gets to Rome, and before he gets to Rome, Tiberius is dead, and that's the last we hear of Pilate. Lots of apocryphal legends about his demise and what happened to him, including the early church said that he might have even become a Christian. Okay, then. But if you see the picture of the man that history records, there's something wrong with the trial now as Jesus is standing before Pilate. So let's do this in order for a minute. And I want you to take a look carefully. We'll start with Matthew's gospel. And if you think this is quite tedious, it is, but it's worth it in the end to show you a picture, which I will just briefly say. If this man was so full of venom and venality, and he was so evil, why did he not take the opportunity while Jesus was in front of him and brought to him as just simply, hey, if I like to kill people, then that's what I'll do, and that's what I'll do, and that's what I do, and therefore I do it. But instead, we find a very different Pilate. We find a man who appears to be summoned in his spirit with reason and with restraint, asking questions. There was, by the way, just as the Jews had an order to order a trial, the Romans had an order to order a trial, whether it was to try a Jew or a Roman citizen. That didn't happen either. So here we have in chapter 27 of Matthew's gospel, and beginning at verse 11. And Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, saying, Art thou the king of the Jews? Now, do you really believe that that's the way the interrogation started? I don't. There's no way. You have to go to Luke and John to see how the interrogation started. If you turn to Luke in chapter 23, in verse 2 it says, And they began to accuse him, saying, We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king. If you think about it, that's kind of the way a trial should start. There's an accusation. That's the proper method. And then, if we could take it one step further, we have in John's gospel, I'll just read it to you. Stay in Luke. I'll read you John's gospel. They bring him before Pilate, and they say to Pilate, if he were not a malefactor, we would not have we delivered him up to thee? In other words, if he was really bad, what accusation do you bring against this man? Well, if he wasn't a criminal, we wouldn't have brought him here. So I want you to see how Caiaphas already had the opportunity to take and to digest and to execute. Simple as that. But there's something in these records that if you read them carefully, in at least two records, it says that Pilate said he knew that the Jewish leaders had delivered Christ out of envy. And there goes such a strange thing. My mind says, did Pilate not want to be involved? Multiple times he says, I find no fault in this man. I've investigated him. I've asked him questions. I find no fault in this man. 3 times minimally. And then on top of that, one of the records has him being sent off to Herod. Now, if this was a mass, cold-blooded Roman killer, why would he send him off to Herod? Well, logic says, well, he found out that Jesus was from Galilee, and Herod is the leader in Galilee, so it has to fall under his jurisdiction, so send him off to him. And then there's that clear question. Herod sends him back to Pilate. So now we have this perplexing thing. You'd think that once Jesus comes back from Herod, well, what is the verdict? Not guilty. Now he's back in front of Pilate. Now there's outrage. And still to this point, nothing overtly is happening. There is no hardcore action being taken. And then you have the wonderful thing, I don't know how this happens, but if you want to call it coincidence, is the message that comes from Pilate's wife. that says, don't harm this man. I had a terrible dream. Have nothing to do with this just man. Now, did she know that Pilate was meeting with him the next day because she had that dream in the middle of the night? Who knows? I don't know. All I know is that all of these internal evidences regarding Pilate's character are completely contradicting his behavior that we see. Now, you say, well, how is this going to lead me to the conclusion of why Jesus actually rose from the dead and all of this being... I'm trying to paint a picture, which is that nobody could really lay a charge to him. And even the man who was that vile didn't want to kill him. Now, the rest of this passage, you can comb through and you can make you can do your own harmony. There have been harmonies made, but you can do your own harmony. No one will debate that at the behest, at the nagging behest of the Jewish leaders, at the hands of the Romans, Jesus was executed. He was crucified. All the records agree that is the way Christ died. He did not die by being stoned. He was not burned. There was no other method. And frankly, there was no other method that it could be. It had to happen this way. Now, I'm heading towards the point. There are a lot of people who study the Word of God who become anti-Semitic because they see this as against Christians. But the reality is that when I looked at this, yes, this had to happen this way. Jesus foretold all of this. He said he would have to go and die at the hands of and how he would be treated. He foretold all of this. The Old Testament prophecies paint the picture. But something else had to happen. We know that he is crucified. We know that the writers, respectively, tell us about the third hour when they crucified him. They reckon the time from sunup, so from 9 a.m., and all accounts say by the 9th hour, being 3 p.m. our time, he was dead. Most of the records will agree with that. One record gives us, or at least two give us, an indication of darkness that came upon the land. And then we have this, everything coming to a close. And where it comes to a close is actually where I begin. Having examined the charges against him, having examined the characters, Caiaphas and Pilate. Herod I have no interest in, and Annas, for the sake of this discussion, I have no interest in, for the sake of this discussion. But having analyzed all this, and having looked at the language, it became obvious to me that really for the scriptures to be fulfilled, it wasn't just that Jesus had to die, but the method had to be this way. Now, will that prove anything later on? Well, it may be valuable in a future discussion, but for right now, I want to plant some thoughts in your mind. Remember, I wrote down this word on my tablet, delivered. And that word becomes extremely important to understand the nature of Christ's death. Without understanding the nature of Christ's death, you will move on very quickly to the burial in the tomb, and you will not see something very significant about the nature and uniqueness of Christ's death. Oh, of course, Pilate marveled when they said he died that quickly, because no one usually dies that quickly from crucifixion. And in fact, if you read the history records, you've got several historians that chronicle, especially the death of St. Andrew, where reportedly he took 2+ days to die on his cross. There are records of, in the 280s and 290s, of people, one couple in particular, a married couple who were crucified, a married couple crucified side by side. They lived for 9 days, and on the 10th day they expired. And it was chronicled that they were encouraging themselves, they were Christians, and they were encouraging themselves in the Lord. But the uniqueness of Christ's death is not, although he died quickly, is not so much that he died quickly, or that the earth shook, or that supposedly the temple veil was rent, or that people came out of tombs, even though I'd say that those are pretty staggering right there. Those are pretty good proofs right there. But there are a few things that I would say are very unique. And this is what they are through language. So I pointed out this word deliver because you'll find it in your scriptures in the King James appearing exactly like this, being delivered. And that word is always used of something being handed over. You pass a torch to somebody. you can hand down something by virtue or by way of inheritance. But it's always a person giving to another. Now, in the records of Jesus' death, we have 3 words being used at the close, when everything is done, when he's been crucified, and his last breath. And here's where you'll find the uniqueness of Christ's death. Well, all the things I've said, but I want you to add the language now. And here it comes. So in Mark and Luke, they use the same words. Are you still in Luke? Good. You'll find in Luke 23 and verse 46, you will find, if you have a Bible like mine, it reads, he gave up the ghost. He gave up the ghost. This is how it would read. This is how it would read. You can have the Greek word right there for pneum. We normally get the word pneuma for spirit, and this is out. We might say he breathed out. So that is being used for both Mark and Luke. In Matthew 27, when Jesus had cried again with a loud voice, yielded up the ghost. You're going to know this word because I've dealt with it before in another message. The message on forgiveness, this is the same word. He released his spirit. He released it. This is, so Mark and Luke are active verbs, and Matthew is an active verb. That's all you need to know. He did it. And then when you get to John, this is why I said this is the uniqueness of Jesus Christ. It's the uniqueness of the language, and it's the uniqueness of something that happened at that moment that John records in John 19, and I believe, if I'm right, 30. Let's see if I'm right. There we go. It says here, he bowed his head and gave up the ghost. That word right there, let's put this for those that are watching, John 19:30, is the Greek word paradokin. Paradokin, which is from a word paradidomai. And if you break that down into a compound, this word here always, when we encounter it, didomai, is always to give. So here, we have another active verb, but here's the remarkable thing. If you are going to comb the words, you'll find that this is being translated elsewhere. This word will be translated in the English sometimes delivered as well, handed over, delivered. The radical thing about John and what he is telling us about Jesus' death is in that last moment after he declared, tetelestai, it is finished, he handed over. That's the only way this word has ever been used. It's never been used of delivering a soul or a spirit except for here. You can comb Liddell and Scott. You can comb all the concordances. You will never find this word used in conjunction with somebody's soul or spirit. And Jesus takes it uniquely and says he is handing over. Now, remember what John records. John says, Jesus saying, no man taketh my life, but I lay it down on myself, and essentially he's going to take it again. Here's the confirmation of that in its uniqueness. No one ever in history has ever handed over their spirit. We don't have control of that. We don't have the ability. Ecclesiastes 8:8 says, no man has the capacity to control the breath in his lungs and the time. That's God's job. So if we were wanting to look at the big picture, you could say, well, John liked to use these words. Well, I prefer to say that John had insight in choosing these words, but he's recording them as Christ saying them. No one has ever been recorded as saying, I hand over my spirit. We read it in other places, in other passages perhaps, but this one is the most staggering. It shows me the uniqueness of Christ's death and the fact that it wasn't a passive death. It was an active death, and it wasn't simply that he breathed his last breath, as Matthew, Mark, and Luke would suggest, but rather that he handed over his spirit. And in the process of understanding this passage, which is at the very core of the most important theology, he was not only sacrifice, the Lamb of God, but he was also high priest. In the act of it not being passive, he fulfills the two things. Hebrews 7:27 talks about how he offered himself up, a little bit different than the Apostle Paul saying, The time for me to be offered up is at hand, but still out of his control. Here's the one controlling all factors. So when people talk about anti-Semitic talk about the Jews or the Romans, Jesus could have probably stayed on that cross for a week or a month, or he could have come down. If he went through a sealed tomb, and if he entered in, by the way, coming into this world, into a closed womb, and then passed through a closed tomb, would it be that difficult for him to come down off of the cross and do it some other way? But the language tells me the uniqueness of this is so radical. Now, why would Joseph of Arimathea, not Mary, mother of Jesus, come to beg for the body? Why do you think? Well, you're going to have to come back next week for that. That's my message. I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.